have to confess that it's getting more and more difficult not only to snap my vest after we eat such a wonderful lunch, but also to keep people's attention. You know, I've talked to several, and it's hard not to go to sleep in the afternoon about right now after a great, nice, big lunch. And so I'll do my best. And it's going to be difficult, particularly today, because Daniel is one of those books that's half real relatable and then half just cryptic. And so, you know, if we were to talk about Daniel in the lion's den, everybody would be on top of that. Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not a problem. But you start talking about those kingdoms and everything that he starts talking about back in Daniel 5 and 7 and some of those chapters, and it's like the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, where he sees this monstrosity of a statue and doesn't know what it is, and Daniel comes in and he tells him in chapter 2, all the way over in chapter 32, the image's head was of fine gold, chest and arms of silver. What he's doing here is telling the future to Nebuchadnezzar the king. Now, we can relate to that. In fact, that's one of the issues Daniel has with a lot of the guys that are in theology with all the letters behind their name, because they, in trying to take away the integrity of Daniel, will try to say that Daniel was written much later in time. And here's why. If a priori, and that means without even considering anything, you just dismiss the idea of miracles and prophecy, Daniel's a stump in the road. You can't give any credibility to Daniel at all unless you believe in prophecy, because he prophesied so specifically about Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, which is the Babylonian kingdom, then the Medo-Persian Empire, then the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great, and then the Roman Empire. And he did it with such precision, and then even talking about the church being set up in that time where this big rock is cut out of a hill and rolls down and wipes everything out, wipes out everything. And then to tell Nebuchadnezzar, you know, you're the one that's the gold head, you're the big guy. You're the start of this image. Well, that's all telling future. If you don't believe in prophecy and you don't believe in the miracle that's involved in being able to prophesy the future, you have to dismiss all of Daniel. Well, there's been lots of real smart guys, a lot smarter than me, which doesn't take much, but they are the ones who are studying this theology stuff, saying there is no way Daniel could have been written at a late date. And so therefore, when we study Daniel, we're looking at Daniel as a prophetic type of book. Lots of prophecy in it. And I know that we could go back and study some of that history, which is fascinating, by the way. Or what we could do is kind of launch off on something a little bit different. And I want to present this in such a way as technical and as deep as you would like to get, you can get. But there are 2 or 3 really great lessons that just jump out that are very pragmatic, practical to you and I in this last section. The first thing I'd like to point out is in verse 4, where Daniel, for the most part, as he is telling the future, gives details about the future. The Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Roman Empire. Okay, all these details just come to life, and then we see them play out in history superbly and to the T, fulfilling Daniel's prophecy. Well, here's a prophecy where Daniel is told in verse 4, you got this prophecy here, and it was given to him, and he doesn't understand it. In fact, we find that out later on. We'll look at that. But he says in verse 4, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. The prophecy is about the time of the quote-unquote end. End of what immediately comes to mind, and we'll look at defining terms as to what the end is according to this prophecy. But he's supposed to shut this book up, and so therefore it's not going to be revealed. Well, isn't it interesting that when you turn over to chapter 5 in Revelation, now we're getting there. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend before you read Revelation, read Ezekiel and read Daniel and get a good handle on it, because a lot of the things that you will see in Revelation come straight out of Daniel and Ezekiel. In fact, when you see phrases that are used, like in Matthew 13, where Jesus said, Isaiah the prophet says, they've got ears to hear and eyes to see, but they're not hearing and they're not seeing, and it's a fulfillment of prophecy. Well, there we have Jesus giving us the exact translation or interpretation, I should say, of that prophecy. So he says, that's what Isaiah said, is prophesying what's going on right now. Well, Daniel didn't say that per se, but it is told us here that you're going to seal up these words, and they're not going to be revealed until later on. Well, you know, in Revelation 5, there is this big, long circumstance in the heavens, in this figurative book, wherein there is a scroll, verse 7, and you get this scroll that John is being told, here's the scroll, but nobody is found to be able to open the scroll because it's sealed up. Well, guess what? A little later on, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom, in verse 12 of Revelation, the 5th chapter, strength and honor and glory, and he is the one who is going to unloose this seal, and then in chapter 6 in Revelation, the seals begin to be revealed, okay? That's what Daniel was told to seal up. So now we're talking about a specific time frame in which Revelation is referencing something Daniel prophesied about. Well, it's kind of interesting to know, what is Daniel prophesying about? Well, it's some kind of an event where certain things will be taking place. Now, the cryptic and hard to understand stuff is something that is wonderful to go research. I'm not going to get into it a lot, like in verse 7, where he talks about that him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. Oh, it's amazing how many different kind of interpretations people have laid on that. But it's interesting that Revelation 12:14 uses that same phrase. As a matter of fact, it's used again before this in Daniel 7:25. It's used here in Daniel 12:7, and then it's used again in Revelation 12:14. That's the only time you see those three phrases. Now, that tells us something. That tells us that whatever Revelation is talking about this book and how it's used here. So, we can kind of put a time frame on it. What is really the tell is in that same verse. And then you're looking at the second part of that scripture in verse 7. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Well, if you're looking at Daniel in its context, the holy people are the Jews. And so therefore, whatever is going to transpire, that's where one indicator is that tells us when that date of these prophecies are going to be held. When that holy people, they're completely shattered. Okay? I'm going to get to that event here shortly. Notice though in verse 11, here's another one. This is another indicator of when that time will be. And from that time, from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be so many days. And we're not going to get into the depth of how many days and what those stand for. But one of the things we can look at is, and from the time that the daily sacrifices are taken away. When the daily sacrifice was taken away, and when the power of the holy people was totally crushed, well, there's only one event in the entirety of history in the Jewish people when that fit, AD 70. That's when it happened. That's when Titus came in, after his adopted father Vespasian came in and started the siege of Jerusalem, and then Titus came in, and the whole city was devastated. It was torn down. People were killed left and right. The devastation was like nothing that had ever been seen before. And that's exactly how both Daniel and John defined this event. Now, it makes it incredibly interesting to try to make these applications and make them match up, and they do. It's a wonderful, really fascinating study. One of these days we'll study Revelation and we'll go through a bunch of this stuff. However, there are several things we can look at that is also practical for us now, and they're not nearly quite so difficult to grasp. Like, for instance, when Daniel is told to shut up the words of the book until the end of time, they're going to be revealed later. You know, that waxes back to Deuteronomy 29:29. There are some things that are secrets with God, and until He reveals them, we don't know what this is about. Now, He did reveal this stuff all the way over in Revelation, and an amazing thing occurs when Titus surrounds Jerusalem and starts killing Jews left and right, and anybody that tried to run out was killed. So many were crucified. There were miles of road with nothing but crucifixes all the way down the road of Jews being crucified. It was unbelievable, the slaughter that Titus meted out on this town, on this city. And so this horrid event is prophesied by Daniel, but it's sealed up. Then it comes out in Revelation, and amazingly enough, you realize as many Christians that had lived in Jerusalem, no Christians were killed during that siege. Wonder why? Well, they understood what John said when he said, man, when you see the eagles out there, which, the sign of the Roman army, don't go back to your house and get stuff. Run. You hit the hills. You get out of there. And that's what they did. And lo and behold, the Jews, by the tons, were killed. The whole system was crushed. In fact, it's just to understand things, the Jewish nation that we have today is a national Jewish nation. They are not a divine Jewish nation. Zionists have totally misunderstood their Old Testament in trying to decide that the Jews coming back to Israel is to set up a state, a country state there, or Jesus can come back to establish his throne and reign on earth again. And that's never going to happen. But that's the perspective people think when they misunderstand AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem and the finality of it. And that's exactly what Daniel is talking about here. And these two indicators tell us exactly how this happens. But nevertheless, this is something God reveals in his own time. So we can know what God reveals by what we read. Second point is when Daniel saw these things, he didn't understand it. Well, that's not unusual. Lots of guys who had prophecies God gave them didn't get it. And they wanted to know what it was. And very often God would explain to them exactly what happened there. In fact, the very concept of inspiration, there were men of old, Peter tells us, who didn't speak of their own. They just spoke words that were from God and didn't really understand it all. And so therefore, even though they didn't understand it all, they spoke exactly what God wanted them to say. Later on, you and I can read things and we can compare texts from inspired writers, and all of a sudden we can understand some things. They just, even angels wanted to look into, wanted to understand. We're not able because God had not revealed everything yet. So there's no problem, like in verse 8, although I heard, I did not understand. And then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? He's curious. By the way, because we don't know something, doesn't mean that it is wrong to ask why we don't know something. But let's understand that if God does not reveal it, we can't know it. We're just going to have to keep wondering. Peter tells us about that when we talk about going to heaven, what it's going to be like. It has not been revealed what we shall be like. We'll be like him, that's what Peter says. We know that. But we don't know all the details of it, and we need to be happy with not knowing what God has not revealed. So therefore, it's not a bad thing not to understand some things because it's beyond us. But we don't need to quit looking and striving to understand. And finally in verse 13, and this is just one of those things where Daniel kind of had to accept the way it was. That I don't know all these things. These words are sealed up. They're going to be explained later. But it says in verse 13, but you go your way till the end. You keep on keeping on. Do what you're supposed to do. But here's the beautiful hope that the book of Daniel ends with. And by the way, this is a hope he had, still not understanding every detail and nuance of the prophecy God gave him. Because God did reveal stuff through Daniel where he told the king, this is what your dream's all about. And he knew the details of it. Pretty impressive to the king, too. But on some occasions, he did not know everything. But he still had this hope and was very confident in this hope because he was told, for you shall rest, and that's that figurative way of saying you're going to die. Okay? We're all going to die. You shall rest and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. You know, there are a lot of folks who have wrongly determined that we don't really know anything about resurrection until we get in the New Testament. That's not true. Okay? I know that my Redeemer lives, David would say. And you know, when you look at this person, Daniel, Ezekiel 14:14 is the one that comes to mind because I always like to rate people. I've got my heroes. I'm named after King David, okay? David botched up so many times, and it's recorded, okay? But he's my hero because I was named after him. But honestly, let's let God set the metric, the bar of who's who, okay? When Ezekiel is prophesying in chapter 14, and he's telling these people, if you don't repent, God's going to bless you, and you're not going to like it, okay? But he says, these people are so bad. Well, let me read the verse because it just explains how bad these people are. He says in verse 12, the word of the Lord came to me saying, 13, Son of man, when the land sins against me by persistent unfaithfulness. I like the New King James translation in that. That captures who these people were. Persistent unfaithfulness. I will stretch out my hand against it. I will cut off its supply of bread, send famine on it, and cut off man and beast from it. Even if these three, now here's God's perspective of who's great, okay? Even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver only themselves by their righteousness, says the Lord God. And that is so rich with so many beautiful lessons. The fact that we are responsible and accountable for what we do, because it would be by their own actions they would save themselves. But they couldn't save that wicked people, and sometimes you just can't save somebody from their own self. They're going to be wrong. But nevertheless, Noah, Daniel, and Job. That doesn't surprise me to see Noah there, preacher of righteousness, a guy responsible for us continuing. The righteous man God found when he wiped out the entire planet. Okay, that's way up there. Job, why, we read Job, we understand so much more about God and His love and His mercy and His graciousness and the fact that He's got a handle on things. We don't have to worry about things even when hard times come. Job, yeah, they're way up there. Daniel's up there too. Daniel was a conduit for God's will for an entire people. And when he closed the book, he said, y'all need to be aware things are going to happen. And I don't understand it, but when this seal is broken and this message is taught, it's going to be the difference between life and death, not just here on earth, but life and death forever. When those sacrifices are done away with and you're not doing any daily sacrifices anymore, which they couldn't do after the destruction of Jerusalem and haven't since then, to this day, haven't done daily sacrifices. That was done away with. When the power of that people, the Jews had great power, when that is crushed, and when was that crushed? AD 70. It was over. The Jewish nation as a whole kind of disappeared. Now, yeah, you still got pieces and parts all over in different countries with different cultures, different backgrounds. And then all of a sudden in 48, we decided, oh, we need to give this to Israel. And now we've got the Jews back. No, not really. You've got an Israeli nation, and it's a secular nation. And they're not God's people. Christians are God's people now. And so therefore, when you look at Daniel, it is quite impressive who he is, the credentials he has with God, and the fact that we can look at this, and if you really want some good, interesting reading, I'm telling you, read Daniel, read Ezekiel, and then read Revelation. It might shock you, the terminology that shows up in Ezekiel, Daniel, and then in Revelation, and how those two compare together. And it might explain why it is that when John got up to get his revelation going, he said, these things are shortly going to come to pass. And oh boy, did they. And when they did, it was devastating for who used to be God's people and no longer were. This didn't accommodate an invitation, but we always offer one in song because we want you to know if you need to change your life, there's an opportunity to do it now. So if you'd like to respond in any way, need any kind of help, we invite you as we stand and sing.